In Humanities 302, we are currently in a section where we are looking at perhaps the most popular view about morality today, at least in the Western world, called cultural relativism. In Humanities 301, we looked at another kind of moral relativism, which is called subjectivism. The main issue here is not that some people just have false beliefs about what's right and what's wrong. Most people who accept cultural relativism do so because they're not quite clear on what it is they're committed to. And so when we talk to people about moral issues and cultural relativism finds its way into the conversation, we have an extra delicate task in trying to get people to become unmuddled and to think clearly about moral problems and moral issues. Because if they could do that, they would see that cultural relativism as a moral viewpoint doesn't have much to recommend it. So we are doing what we call moral philosophy, which is a little different than what we're used to when we talk about moral issues, because we're asking a kind of question we're not accustomed to asking. When we think about moral issues, we tend to dive right into the important ones, the ones that have the most weight. So we might dive right into the abortion issue and ask whether abortion is right or wrong. Or we might think about things like, is lying ever justified? But our answers to those questions, our arguments and reasoning about those particular questions depend on our giving an answer to a more basic and more fundamental question. What is it that makes an act right or wrong in the first place? What is the nature of morality, the nature of the right and the good? What do all right acts have in common that make them right? When thinking about moral issues, we tend to avoid this most basic or fundamental question. When thinking about other issues, we often do implicitly recognize we need to get answers to certain questions first before we do other things. So the example I like to use is that of the bush baby. Suppose we're on an African safari, we're about to leave for the day, you're sitting in the Jeep, and I'm not feeling well. So I run up to the Jeep and I hand you a camera, and I say, do me a favor, I'm not feeling well, so take this camera, and if you see a bush baby, take a picture of one for me. And then the Jeep takes off. Before you can ask me the most basic logical question, which is, what is a bush baby? If you're going to go on a search for a bush baby, you should probably know what you're looking for. You should probably have some idea where you would find one and how you would know if you found one. At least with bush babies, we can describe them. We can give a physical description, even if we're not able to give a scientific definition of what a bush baby is. And so just with that physical description, we have something we've latched onto that will help us identify whether the animal before us is a bush baby. But with morality, things aren't that simple, because right and wrong, moral rightness and moral wrongness, don't look any particular way. They don't have a certain sound. They don't have a certain taste. Rightness and wrongness aren't things that we can identify just by their physical features. They're not a certain color. And so it is especially important when thinking about moral issues. And when we go on a search for the morality of something like abortion or euthanasia, that we step back and ask this most basic question first, because then we'll know what to look for if we have an answer to that question. What is it that right acts have in common that make them right? And the different moral theories are different attempts to answer this question. Think of it this way. We have three shapes up here. They're all, I would say, rectangular. We're willing to apply the word rectangle to each of them. If we're going to apply the same word to each of them, they better have something in common where it makes sense for us to apply the same word in each case to each shape. The same for morality. If we're going to call different acts right, like caring for one's children being morally right, giving to the poor as morally right, being loyal to one's friends as something that's morally right. If we're going to call each of these things right, we better think they have something in common that justifies are using the same word to describe each of them. And so that's what we're doing when we're giving moral theories, is trying to uncover what it is these paradigmatic right actions have in common that make them right. The first theory we're talking about, and we looked at in Humanities 301, is moral utilitarianism. And it says an act is right when it produces the best consequences, when it maximizes the good and minimizes what's evil. Or an act is right when it produces the greatest amount of happiness and the least amount of pain for everyone affected by that action. Another view, when we talk about Humanities 201, is divine command theory. This one's popular among religious people, especially Christians. An act is right because it is commanded by God. It's not whether it produces the best consequences. It's simply whether God has commanded or forbidden something. So on the utilitarian view, moral rightness just is producing the best consequences. They're one and the same thing, says the utilitarian. The divine command theorist says no. That's not what makes an act right. What makes it right is being commanded by God. Another view, natural law theory, an act is right when it is conducive to human flourishing. So this view disagrees with these two. It's saying being right is not a matter of being commanded by God. That's not the essence. That's not the nature of moral rightness. It's whatever is conducive to fulfilling the nature of a thing. Cultural relativism, which is the one we're dealing with now, an act is right when the majority of the culture approves of it. So according to the cultural relativists, these three views are mistaken, because an act's being right has nothing to do with the consequences, has nothing to do with whether it's commanded by God. In fact, most cultural relativists probably believe that God doesn't exist. Has nothing to do with human flourishing. The culture determines what's right or wrong. They construct what's right or wrong by approving or disapproving of certain things. And then finally, subjectivism, another type of relativism. We can call it individual relativism as well. It's just like cultural relativism. It says, yeah, it's not about what's going on in the world, whether God commands something, whether it produces the best consequences, that determines whether an act is right or wrong. It's not the culture either, but it's the individual. So an act is right when I approve of it. So each of these theories is giving this definition of moral rightness. And they can't all be correct, because they all disagree. So if we have these theories in front of us, if we're thinking in this way, then we have a way we can think coherently and clearly about moral issues. Because if you're a utilitarian and you're thinking about the abortion issue, what should stand out to you is the consequences of making abortion legal or illegal. Would women be compelled to get abortions in unsafe conditions? Would abortion only be available to the wealthy woman who would be able to go to some other country and get an abortion? Or think about capital punishment. If utilitarianism is correct, and what makes something right, or what makes a law or punishment right or just, is whether it produces the best consequences, then for the utilitarian, when thinking about capital punishment, what they need to focus on is whether capital punishment produces the best consequences, whether having capital punishment as a law would make society better off. So you look at things like, does the crime rate go down? Does murder go down when there's capital punishment? For a divine command theorist, if you're thinking about capital punishment, you try to figure out what God has commanded. If God has commanded us to use capital punishment is morally justified. If you're a cultural relativist and you're thinking about the capital punishment issue, it's quite easy to figure out what the right answer is. You just take a poll. You figure out what the majority of the culture approves of. Because if the majority approve of capital punishment, it becomes right. It is justified. Because the culture determines, constructs, makes things right or wrong by their attitude toward those things. And if subjectivism is true, then when thinking about the capital punishment issue, all you really need to do is introspect and ask yourself, how do I feel about this? And if you find yourself disapproving of capital punishment, then you should say capital punishment is wrong, and it would literally be wrong for you. But if you think, no, I approve of it, I think there's something good in it, then you should say capital punishment is right, because you are the standard of what's right or wrong. You make things right or wrong by feeling a certain way about them. There's a pattern here among these moral theories. We've got 5 of them, and we can divide them into 2 groups: the objectivist group, the realist group, or the relativist constructivist group. This is what all the objectivist views have in common. Acts are right or wrong independently of our thoughts or attitudes toward them. So on the utilitarian view, for instance, an act is right when it produces the best consequences, regardless of how we think or feel about it. Divine command theory view, an act is right because God commands it, regardless of how we think or feel about it. So for the divine command theorist, capital punishment is justified if God commands it, regardless of whether we approve of it or accept it. Another way of putting the point of objectivism is that the objectivist believes there are universal moral truths that apply to all people at all times. And they apply to all people at all times regardless of whether those people recognize them or choose to accept them. The other view is the relativist view. All the views here say whatever you approve or disapprove of, or what the culture approves or disapproves of, is not relevant to whether something is right or wrong. But on this side, whether an act is right or wrong depends on our attitudes toward it. We make things right or wrong by feeling a certain way about them. According to the cultural relativist, it's the majority of the culture that makes things right or wrong by approving or disapproving of them. The subjectivist view is similar, but it says it's not the culture that makes things right or wrong. It's the individual. We are each our own moral standard. We each make things right or wrong by feeling a certain way about them. If God forbids abortion, according to the divine command theorist, whether one approves of it or not is irrelevant to whether it's right or wrong. Because if divine command theory is true, something is right if it's commanded by God, it is wrong if it is forbidden by God.